So it's that time of year. It's time to talk about programming languages in 2024. And for this, I'm going to do my first tier list. And this tier list, I need to put some disclaimer, some fine print on it. This tier list is for beginners, and we're going to be evaluating these various languages as for how impactful or helpful they will be to get you your first job and break into the field. Because nobody can deny that 2023 was a rough year for programming languages and the environment has changed. So given that change in the environment, how did I choose what languages to put on this list? Well, I went over to the TIOBE index and I took the top 20. Now I did cut a few of them out because they're not really relevant to programming, like Scratch on the list at number 11 here. That one is for beginners. That's for grade schoolers, middle schoolers who are exploring coding. Great language, but not something you're typically going to get a job in. So again, we're going to filter this through the list of setting up a good career in programming. And this has changed because of all the stuff that's happened in 2023. Now, I am going to go through this in alphabetical order, and I am going to explain why I am putting languages where I am putting them through that lens, the beginner who wants to break into the field. So with that, let's get started. So starting with the letter A, and A is for assembler. Now, assembler is pretty much the lowest level language that you are going to encounter. This is the language that is closest to the processor, closest to ones and zeros. It's very difficult to learn, and it's very difficult to be effective in. And frankly, there's not a lot of people in the world who need to work in assembler. And those people that do, these are typically hardcore computer science people, PhD people. This is not something for the typical beginner. In fact, even if you had this interest as a beginner, I would recommend you start somewhere higher up the chain and work your way down to assembler rather than just starting there. So that, the lack of jobs, you don't want anything to do with assembler as a beginner. I mean, it's cool to look at, but don't spend any time on this. Now, next up, we have C and C++. Now, these two are related. They're not the same language. A lot of people group them together. I do it colloquially at times, and that's okay. But these two languages are closer to the bare metal. You will get a minor in computer science learning these two languages because you have to learn how to manage memory. And there's a lot of different ways that you can shoot yourself in the foot with these languages. But they are very powerful, and a lot of infrastructure and embedded software runs in these two languages. Now, the main difference between them, I'm going to oversimplify it, but C++ is your more object-oriented approach, and it has a lot of stuff sprinkled on top of it for goodness, and C is more bare bones and straightforward. Now, both of these languages do make you a better programmer, so if you learn these, you are going to become a better software generalist, and that's a good thing. But the bad thing for you as a beginner is that most of those embedded software, robotics, and infrastructure type jobs, those tend to go to computer science graduates. Those are not something that you, without a computer science degree, just getting started in programming, it's going to be very difficult for you to break into the field with one of these languages. But because they are so powerful and because they are useful, I gotta put them probably in B tier. There's nothing wrong with learning these languages. But like I said, as a pure beginner, no computer science degree, that's a rough start for you. I don't recommend you really start there. So moving on, let's talk about C#. Now, I'm going to admit right now, I sell C# courseware, and there's a reason that I sell C# courseware and why C# is one of my favorite languages. And this is because of its versatility. The C#.NET stack is cross-platform, and it does everything. It's like the Visa of programming languages. You can build games, you can build web applications, you can build desktop applications, you can build embedded software, you can build mobile apps. Pretty much any type of application that you would want to build, you can do it in C# and .NET. And besides that, it is very transferable because it is based on the C language. And there is a certain family of languages, C-based languages, that have a lot in common. So if you learn C#, it's very easy to learn Java. And it's much easier to learn C and C++. And it's easier to learn PHP. And it's easier to learn JavaScript. So for those reasons, I think that C# is a great first language for beginners. And not only that, I haven't even talked about the tooling, because Visual Studio and the Microsoft tooling and the way the language is structured with its type checking and the way it teaches you how to organize code like enterprises do, it's just a really good, gentle entry into enterprise programming, which is something that some other popular languages lack. So C#, I gotta put it up here in S tier. Now next we have the letter F, which is for Fortran. Now, I was actually really surprised to see Fortran in the top 20. Now, like I said, the TIOBE index is not really super scientific. It has ways of measuring language interest, and Fortran happened to pop into that top 20. Now, it is a pretty solid language for scientific computing, and that's probably how it got into the top 20, because data science and analytics have been pretty hot over the last few years, and Fortran is good at many of those things. But again, we're talking about beginners who want to become developers at enterprise companies like normal businesses. And for the most part, Fortran is not the language that's going to get you there. This is being used by people that are specialized in that scientific computing space. This is not for your average run-of-the-mill new developer. So let's move right on. Next, we have Go. Now, Go has a lot of popularity in the programming community. It's very favorably looked on. But again, we got to take this back. We got to talk about beginning developers and people just getting started in their journey. They're looking for their first job. And the problem with Go in this case is that it's very specialized. This is something that was developed for large companies, your Google, your FAANG companies, to manage their high-level infrastructure and those projects that run at scale. And the reality of this situation is that the majority of the world does not operate at that scale or have those kinds of needs. So even though this is a really cool language, it's not something that I would recommend a beginner start with. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in C tier. It's definitely more useful than learning assembler or Fortran, but first job, first language, I'm not feeling that one. So moving on from Go, we get into Java. Now Java is the cousin of C#. It came before C#. C# is kind of like the kid in school who copied Java's homework and then made some changes and actually did it a little bit better. But Java is one of the #1 languages for enterprise jobs in the world. And for that reason alone, you have to put it in S tier. There are just so many job opportunities available in Java. It also teaches you structure, and it's used in the enterprise. It has good packaging, it has pretty good tooling, and it is pretty versatile in the same way that C# is. I mean, your TVs and internet devices and things like that, they can use Java. Now, it has been falling off a little bit in that area in recent years, especially in like mobile. It's being replaced by Kotlin. So I don't think it's as good as C# when you're just talking about versatility, but there is so much enterprise code out there that is written in Java. And these organizations appreciate developers who understand structure and understand organization and can build object-oriented, resilient applications. And that is what Java is going to teach you. So now we come to JavaScript, and JavaScript is the hardest language on this tier list to rank. And it's because of the way the market has changed in 2023. Now, I'm a little bit older. I lived through the .com crash. So the late 90s, early 2000s, that's when I was just getting started in my career. And I see some parallels to what happened back then to what happened now. There was a hype cycle, and there was a bubble, and there was overhiring, and it was very easy pre-.com crash for people who just learned some really quick superficial web creation skills using like HTML, CSS, and Dreamweaver back then to get into the field and get a high-paying job. And everybody started doing that. And the bubble grew, the bubble grew, the bubble grew. And then eventually the reality of economics came in, the market corrected, and all those people got pushed out. And I kind of see the same thing happening today, where from like 2018 to the end of 2022, we were building a bubble. And when the pandemic happened and everything went remote, a lot of companies went, oh, wow, we have to get our web development presence put together. And so they were consuming people with these skill sets, and they didn't really care if it was superficial because they just needed to get their web applications and stuff created. Now, fast forward to 2023, we've had a huge correction. And during that build-up time, during that bubble, we saw that almost all the coding boot camps are teaching front-end JavaScript. And then you have the free resources for the self-learners like Free Code Camp and the Odin Project and even a bunch of Udemy courses. I mean, there are a million front-end JavaScript courses out there, and they were producing tens of thousands of people with a cookie-cutter skill set. So one of the big problems as a beginner for JavaScript is that there is an oversaturation of that skill set, and it's very hard to differentiate yourself if that's the only thing you know. But on the other hand, web development jobs are some of the most common developer jobs. Every developer has to know JavaScript. There's no way around it. It needs to be a part of your toolkit. But stepping back and thinking about getting that first job, JavaScript alone is not enough. JavaScript is friendly and easy to get into because it often lacks the structure of the other languages, the C-based languages that I put up there, like C# and Java and C++ and C and a couple of the other ones I'm going to get into later. So JavaScript doesn't have as much transferability. And for that reason, I typically don't recommend it as the first language that you go deep into. I think that everybody should learn it, and everybody needs to learn it, but I gotta put it in A tier because you need it in the toolkit. It's not the greatest first language. And if it's the only thing you know and you take one of these fast and superficial tracks into the field, you are going to be the same as tens of thousands of other people competing for the same jobs, and you are going to have a really hard time breaking into the space and getting your first job if that's all you know. Now, 3 years ago, it would have been an S tier because you could absolutely just do that superficial track and get right into a job. But that is not the reality of the situation in 2023 and probably 2024. So JavaScript drops from S tier to A tier. So next we have K for Kotlin. Now, Kotlin is a derivative of Java. It runs on the Java virtual machine, just like the Java language, and it is primarily used in Android development. You can build server-side applications and other types of apps using Kotlin, but the reality of the situation is it's not often used outside of mobile development yet. It is growing in popularity. It's a very interesting language, and it does teach you good structure and things like Java does. And for that reason and its ability to build mobile apps, I gotta put it up here. I kind of want to put it in between A tier and B tier. I think it's a really good language to learn, and learning mobile development and breaking into the field that way is something that is possible to do. It's not going to give you as many job opportunities as learning Java. So if you have the time and the inclination, I would learn Java first, and then I would learn Kotlin second, because a lot of your knowledge is going to transfer from Java to Kotlin, and being in that mobile app development space is a place where there is not the same kind of oversaturation that you see from the JavaScript kind of front-end skill set. So if you want to work on UIs and you want to be different than everybody else, Kotlin is not a bad way to get there, and I think it's a language that's going to continue growing in popularity in the future, and again, it lacks that oversaturation. Now next, we have MatLab. And I almost didn't put MatLab on here because it's not really a programming language. This is a language for data analytics and data science, but it did show up in the TIOBE list. But we're talking about developer positions, not data analyst positions, not data scientist positions. So MatLab is going to go down here in F tier just because it's not relevant to a lot of developer careers. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to jump ahead in the list and I'm going to put R down here as well, because R is another statistical data analytics, data, science kind of language. Both of these things are not something that software developers, people looking to break into the field as a standard developer, is going to want to learn. One or the other is going to be great if you're trying to get out of development and get into data analytics, but that's not who I'm talking about in this tier list. And next up we have PHP. And this is a language, it's kind of weird. If you're a beginner just getting into the space and you research PHP, you're going to see a lot of experienced developers that are kind of disdainful of PHP. It's not really fair, but it does get made fun of a lot and looked down on by kind of mainstream developers. But let me tell you something about PHP. It does teach you good structure. It's actively being maintained, and it has a lot of good new features that have come into it in the last few years. And PHP is one of the kings of gig jobs because PHP goes into WordPress, and WordPress is one of the most commonly used engines for creating websites in the world. So if you know how to write PHP and you can work on those plugins and you can help things with WordPress, you can make money as a PHP developer doing contract and gig work for all sorts of businesses around the world. So if you're somebody who's struggling with getting any experience and breaking into the field, learning enough PHP to be able to do those jobs is absolutely worth it. Now, that being said, if you have friends who are developers in other languages, they're going to make fun of you. Sorry, it's just kind of the reality of the situation. Again, I don't think that's really fair, but PHP, I think, goes into A tier just because of that gig worker kind of thing and the way it does syntax, because it has a lot in common with the other C-based languages, so it will have less quirks and things than JavaScript. Now, I'll probably just move this down just a little bit because I think you should learn JavaScript over PHP if you're kind of making choices. This is kind of how I would weight them, but it is not a bad language to learn. Not at all. And I think as an entry point to developer careers, it's fine. I think there's some better choices, but there's nothing wrong with PHP. Don't let anybody, making fun of it or talking smack about PHP talk you out of exploring it as a language option. And now we have Python. And Python is another really difficult one for most people to rank. It's not going to be difficult for me because I'm going to put Python right into the B tier. And I'm going to tell you why. Python is one of the most popular languages in the world, and it has a lot of buzz. The syntax is easy. It has great libraries and great plugins. But we're doing this tier list through getting your first developer job. And the reality of Python is that it's a great general purpose language, but it is most commonly used in data analytics, data engineering, and data science. And if you go out, I challenge you, just go out to the job websites like Indeed.com and look up Python and then filter it down to the web developer frameworks that Python uses like Flask and Django. And you will see that less than 5% of all listed Python jobs are for those web frameworks. Python just isn't as commonly used as a web developer or generalist developer language as the other options on this list. Now, if you're interested in data analytics and data science, or, you want to do DevOps, or, there's a lot of scripting that's done in cybersecurity, Python, it's a great language. I'm not crapping on Python. I'm just saying when you filter it down through the lens of, I am a person who wants to become a software developer for a company, Python just is not a great choice for that. These other languages are going to do you much better. Now, learning Python as a second or third or fourth language is awesome because of that versatility, and it lets you kind of change job roles and do more things than you could have done as just a regular Java developer, for example. But as a starting point and getting to your first developer job, I don't think Python is a great choice. And next we have Ruby. Now, Ruby is the only language on this list that I actually kind of feel like crapping on. I am not a fan of Ruby. Its syntax is not similar enough to other languages. I don't think it has high transferability. And as far as a language for getting a job, it has really fallen off. I mean, really fallen off. Back in like 2012, 2010 to 2015, Ruby was one of the fastest frameworks for getting a data-driven website up and running because of the Rails framework. And that's what really blasted up Ruby's popularity at the time. And then all the other languages started releasing web frameworks, and Node came out, and everybody else could build applications that were data-driven rapidly, pretty much as fast as Rails could. And then it just fell off a cliff. And if you go out and you look for Ruby jobs today, especially at the entry level, there's just not a lot to be had there. And then, like I said, on top of that, when you look at the syntax of the language and how it's different than a lot of the other languages on this list, it also has low transferability. So Ruby, I gotta put it like right here. I mean, it's better than learning some of these F-tier languages, but if you're choosing between Ruby and Go, I mean, you should take Go every day of the week. Just not a great language. I'm sorry, Ruby people. And that's one of the things when you meet Ruby people out in the wild, they love Ruby. I mean, they just really, really love that language and they take care of their own. But, you know, you can't honestly look at the data and say, wow, you know, Ruby is a great language for beginners to learn in 2024. Now, the next language on the list we're going to talk about is Rust. Now, Rust is really interesting to me because Rust is now competing with C and C++ because it has that power, it has that performance, but it also has a lot of safety features built into the language that can prevent you from shooting your foot off like you can with the other two languages, C and C++. But then again, I got to filter it back to beginners. And if you're a beginner looking for your first job, Rust is interesting. It's something that I personally would like to learn in the next 5 years. But as a beginner without a computer science degree, I think it falls into that same category as C and C++, where, you know, you don't really want to be there with Rust. So I'm going to put that there. And if you're an experienced developer, this Rust probably ranks a little more towards the A tier, depending on what kind of jobs you want to do. I think it's cool. I think there's opportunities there. I think it's a great language to learn. But again, beginner, there's just not enough opportunity there for beginners. And now next we have SQL. Now, SQL goes immediately to the S tier. But like JavaScript, SQL alone is not enough to get you a job. But I will tell you that the business world runs on data, and the majority of the data is in relational databases and requires SQL. And SQL is also required for data analytics and data engineering jobs. And one of the problems I have with some of these quick short paths into software development is that they tend to throw people into ORMs. They tend to not teach people data modeling and SQL. And I think that's a really bad thing, because SQL is a skill that needs to be in your tool belt and will be added to all of these languages. It is worth learning. It should not be your first language because it's not, I mean, it's Turing complete. It's a programming language, but it's not something you stand alone and get a job in. But it should definitely be something you should learn along with one of these other languages. And you can learn them concurrently. SQL is not a difficult language to learn. It's designed to be easy. And now we've reached the end of the list and we have Swift. Now Swift, very similar to Kotlin, except it's iOS. And if you're going to do iOS development, Swift is the language. It's the one that Apple supports. And Apple is pretty good about keeping their garden kind of closed to outsiders. You can build iOS apps and things like React Native with JavaScript. You can build iOS apps with C#. But if you're building a serious performant iOS app, you're going to be reaching for Swift. And Swift is object-oriented. It has really good structure and it teaches you great structure, just like some of the other languages do. It's kind of C-based. There's a lot of really good things going for Swift, but it's really the kind of same things that are going well for Kotlin. So if you do want to be a mobile developer and you learn both of these, you're going to be in really good shape. But otherwise, I got to rank it kind of the same as Kotlin because it solves the same kind of problems as Kotlin does. And then last and kind of least is Visual Basic. Now, this hurts me. This hurts me personally because Visual Basic was the first language that I got a job in. And VB back in the day with Windows Forms was a really good entry point to learning how to code and learning how to write desktop applications in the Microsoft stack. And it's always going to be near and dear to my heart because it was the language that got me into the field. But we're living in 2024 and I'm not living in the past. And VB.NET, although it's still out there and it's in the top 10 on the TIOBE list because there are a lot of legacy applications in VB that have been migrated to VB.NET. But as a first language, as something to break into the field, VB is absolutely F tier. And I'm going to tell you why. The .NET framework is the .NET framework, and there's a lot of different languages, F#, C#, VB.NET, but the framework itself, the way you use the types and the way you approach building applications is very similar. So if you're even remotely interested in VB jobs, or maybe you have a government facility or something nearby that has applications written in VB.NET, you should learn C#. And then once you learn C# and you learn .NET, you can pick up Visual Basic in a weekend. So it's just not something you should start with. It's not something you should focus on. If you need to learn this language and you know these other ones, you're going to be just fine. You can just pick it up. It's really easy. It's almost easier than Python in some ways. So that wraps things up for the TIOBE top 20 languages and where I would rank them for beginners in 2024. And the ones that ended up in the B tier, like I said, the common theme there is that they're usually paired with a STEM degree like computer science, or in the case of Python, the reality of Python jobs is that they're not really software developer, web developer focused. That Python is used in so many other areas more popularly than they are for software development. So anything above that B tier line is a really good place to start. Just be aware of the problem with JavaScript and being JavaScript only. I recommend you learn it, but you should really pair it with one of the other languages in that S and A tier, whether it's PHP, C# or Java. And everybody should learn SQL. Happy coding.